Venezuela holds the largest proven reserves of oil on Earth. More than Saudi Arabia, more than Iraq, more than Iran, more than Canada, more than the United States. Beneath this single country lies more crude than beneath any other nation on the planet. Over 300 billion barrels of it waiting in the ground. And yet, across the last decade, Venezuela has lived through one of the deepest economic collapses ever recorded in a country that was not at war. Its economy lost roughly 3/4 of its size. Its money lost value so quickly that at the worst of it, prices doubled every few weeks. And close to 8 million of its people, almost 1 in 4, packed what they could carry and left. Both of these things are true at the same time. The richest ground on Earth and some of the hardest years any modern nation has faced. How does a country come to sit on a fortune and go hungry on top of it? To answer that, you have to set the oil aside for a while, because the oil is the youngest thing in this story. It is barely 100 years old, and the country it broke open is far older and far stranger than the headlines that now carry its name. Long before there was a Venezuela, there were the people who named the land without meaning to. When the first Spanish ships reached this coast at the very end of the 15th century, the sailors found villages built out over the water, houses raised on wooden stilts above a wide, shallow lake. To European eyes, those stilt houses record another city built on water, far away across the Atlantic. And so they wrote down a small, almost joking name, Little Venice, in their language, Venezuela. An accident of memory scribbled onto a map. The whole country still carries it, and the lake that earned the name is the same lake where, 4 centuries later, the oil would come roaring out of the ground. Remember that lake. We will come back to it. But the people who already lived here had their own names for this place and their own inheritance. In the cool highlands of the west, a farming people called the Timoto Cuica had terraced the slopes into irrigated fields and stored their water in stone tanks. They left behind almost no monuments. What they left behind instead was a recipe. They took maize, ground it, and pressed it into a thick, round cake cooked on a flat stone. They called it the arepa. 500 years later, it is still the first thing many Venezuelans eat in the morning. Hold on to the arepa, too. It outlives almost everything in this film. This is a country that does not fit into one idea of itself. It is Caribbean and Andean and Amazonian all at once. It has snow and desert and rainforest inside the same borders. To understand how it rose so high and fell so far, you have to walk it. So let us begin where the name began, in the northwest, on the shore of the lake. Lake Maracaibo is the largest body of water in South America. It is not quite a lake and not quite a sea. A narrow channel connects it to the Caribbean, so salt water mixes with fresh, and the whole basin sits in a bowl of heat, ringed by mountains. For most of human history, this was a quiet corner of the world. Fishermen in those stilt villages, cattle on the plains beyond. Then, in 1922, near a town on the eastern shore, a drilling crew lost control of a well. The crude came up under its own pressure and did not stop. For 9 days, it sprayed into the air, throwing out around 100,000 barrels a day before it could be capped. The blowout was so large, it darkened the surrounding fields. Within a few years, more than 100 foreign companies were drilling around the lake. By the end of that decade, this one country had become the second largest oil producer in the world, behind only the United States. The fortune had announced itself, and it had announced itself here, in the same water that gave the country its name. The oil built a city on the lake's western shore. Maracaibo grew rich and hot and proud, the second city of the country with its own way of speaking and its own music, the gaita, played at Christmas across the whole nation. In 1962, engineers threw a bridge more than 8 kilometers long across the narrow neck of the lake, one of the longest in the world at the time, named for a general who had once written the country's constitution. From its span, you could look down and see two things at once: the old stilt houses still standing in the shallows, and the forest of steel derricks marching out across the water. The 15th century and the 20th sharing the same lake.
There is something else about this lake.
Something that has been happening over its southern marshes every night for as long as anyone can remember, and that has nothing to do with oil at all. Where the Catatumbo River empties into the lake, the warm, wet air rising off the water collides with cold air spilling down from the Andes, night after night, in almost exactly the same place. The result is lightning. Not an occasional storm, but a near continuous one. On as many as 260 nights a year, for up to 10 hours at a stretch, the sky over the marsh flickers and cracks, sometimes 28 strikes in a single minute. From far out at sea, sailors once used it to navigate, steering by a storm that almost never goes out. It has been called the Lighthouse of Maracaibo. It is worth holding that image. A country that would one day be defined by the rise and fall of its wealth, with a lake at its heart that simply keeps flashing, indifferent whether the nation around it is rich or poor. The lightning was here before the oil. It will be here after it. Before we leave the north, the coast deserves a moment of its own, because it is where the outside world first touched this country and where it kept misreading it. Out in the Caribbean lie the islands, Margarita, the Pearl Island, where Spanish ships once forced divers down again and again for the oysters that made a few men rich and worked many others to death. Farther out, the coral cays of Los Roques scatter across turquoise water, a national park of more than 300 islets, where the sea is so clear the boats seem to float on air. On the mainland, the town of Cumaná, founded in 1523, was the first lasting European settlement on the whole South American continent. And it was from this coast that the oldest Venezuelan obsession set out. The legend of El Dorado, the Golden One, a king said to cover himself in gold dust, a city of gold somewhere in the interior. For 3 centuries, it pulled explorers up the rivers and into the forest, chasing a fortune that was never there. They did not find the gold. Centuries later, a different country would find a different fortune underground, the black kind, and chase it just as hard. The pilot who found the great waterfall, you will recall, was himself looking for gold when he saw it. The search never really stopped. Only the thing it was searching for changed color. And then there is a sight that should not exist in a tropical country at all. On a thin neck of land near the city of Coro, the wind has piled the sand into true desert dunes, the Médanos de Coro rolling and shifting like a piece of the Sahara dropped onto the edge of the Caribbean. Camels were once brought here to cross them. A country with snow on its highest peaks and rainforest in its south also keeps a working desert on its coast. It refuses again to be only one thing. South and east of the lake, the land flattens and opens into one of the great grasslands of the continent. The Venezuelans call it the Llanos, the plains. For half the year, it bakes under a hard sun until the ground splits. For the other half, the rivers spill their banks and turn the whole expanse into a shallow inland sea. Most people, glancing at a map, would call this emptiness. It is the opposite of empty. It may be the most crowded stretch of life in the entire country. When the floods come, the water spreads life across the plain. Capybara, the largest rodents on Earth, graze the wet margins in family groups, animals the size of a big dog that swim as easily as they walk. Spectacled caiman drift in the shallows, and in the deeper channels lies an animal that very nearly vanished from this story altogether. The Orinoco crocodile is one of the largest predators in the Americas. The biggest can reach close to 7 meters, more than 20 feet, from snout to tail. For most of the 20th century, they were hunted for their hides, almost to nothing, until only a few hundred remained in the wild. They survive now in part because of people who count them, breed them, and carry the young ones back to the rivers by hand, one generation at a time. The crocodile is not safe, but it is still here. In a country that has lost a great deal, that counts for something. The crocodile shares the water with the largest snake on the continent. The green anaconda, thick as a man's thigh, hunts in the slow channels, killing not with venom, but by coiling and constricting, taking caiman and capybara and the occasional unlucky deer. In the deeper rivers swims a creature stranger still, the pink river dolphin, pale and almost rose-colored, with a long beak and a flexible neck that lets it turn among the flooded trees. The plainsmen tell stories about it, that it can come ashore at night in human form. Science tells a quieter story of a freshwater dolphin that hunts in water so muddy that eyes are nearly useless, feeling its way instead by sound. On the land between the floods move the great loners of the plain. The giant anteater walks the grass on its knuckles, nose to the ground, tearing open ant nests with claws long enough to gut a jaguar, swinging a tail like a gray banner behind it. The giant otter, nearly 6 feet from nose to tail, the largest otter on Earth, works the rivers in noisy family groups, loud enough that fishermen call it the river wolf. And overhead, a flash of orange and black marks the troupial, the national bird, singing from a fence post above a country that chose it as the symbol of itself. Above the water, the wet season turns the sky into traffic. Scarlet ibis, so red they look painted, wheel in flocks over the marsh and settle into the trees at dusk until the branches themselves seem to catch fire. Storks stalk the shallows, and moving among the cattle on horseback are the people who made this plain their own. The llaneros, the plainsmen of Venezuela, are the country's cowboys. They have worked these floodlands for centuries, driving herds across water, sleeping in hammocks slung between trees, singing to keep the cattle calm. Their music has a name of its own. The joropo, fast and turning, driven by a small harp and the rattle of maracas, is the sound of the plains. When Venezuelans far from home want to remember exactly where they come from, this is often the music they reach for. It came out of this grass, under this enormous sky, long before anyone thought to drill beneath it. And the plainsmen are not only part of the country's music, they are part of its founding. Because to understand Venezuela at all, you have to meet the man whose name the country now carries. And the plains were where his war was nearly won and very nearly lost. His name was Simón Bolívar. He was born in 1783 into one of the wealthiest families in Caracas, the city wedged into a green valley behind the coastal mountains. He could have lived an easy life. Instead, he spent it trying to break an empire. Picture the city he loved. It is the 26th of March, 1812. Caracas is at prayer. It is the Thursday before Easter, and the churches are full. And the ground begins to move. A powerful earthquake tears through the valley in a matter of seconds. Bell towers fall into the crowds beneath them. Whole streets of houses come down at once. By the time the dust settles, thousands of people are dead, and much of the young independence movement, which had declared a republic only months before, lies buried with them. The royalist priests told the survivors that the earthquake was the judgment of God on their rebellion. And in the rubble, the story goes, Bolivar stood and answered them. If nature itself opposed him, he said, he would fight nature and force it to obey. Whether he said those exact words, no one can prove, but the sentiment was real. He lost that republic and the next one, and fought back from exile across the plains with the help of the same llaneros who had once ridden against him. By 1821, on a field called Carabobo, the war was effectively won. Bolivar did not stop at Venezuela. He carried the campaign across the Andes and helped free 5 nations from Spanish rule. They called him the Liberator. He dreamed of binding the new republics into a single great country, a united continent strong enough to stand on its own. That dream did not hold. The Union fractured within his lifetime, and he died, sick and disillusioned, at 47, far from the city of his birth. And the war did not end on land. 2 years after Carabobo in 1823, the last great battle for Venezuelan independence was fought on water, on Lake Maracaibo itself, the same lake that gave the country its name. A small patriot fleet trapped and destroyed the Spanish ships there, and with that, the empire's hold on Venezuela was finished. The country was born in part on the surface of the very lake where 100 years later, the oil would rise and the trouble would begin. The water that named it, the water that helped free it, and the water that would one day come to stand for its undoing. All of it, the same water.
Remember Bolivar's dream of a continent held together?
Almost 2 centuries later, his country's people would scatter across the very nations he tried to unite. But that is the end of the story, and we are still near its beginning. The valley Bolivar was born in still holds the capital. Caracas today is a city of towers and motorways stacked against the mountainside, with the green wall of the Avila rising straight up behind it, separating the city from the Caribbean just beyond. It is loud, fast, and fiercely proud, and the country it governs runs from that coast all the way up into the clouds. West along the spine of the Andes, the land climbs until it touches snow. Pico Bolivar, named for the Liberator, rises to almost 5,000 meters, the highest point in the country. In the mountain town of Merida, a cable car still climbs from the warm valley floor up past the tree line to the bare, cold, high country the Venezuelans call the Paramo, a strange world of mist and spiky, silver-leaved plants found almost nowhere else. And in those mountains lives the only bear in all of South America. The spectacled bear, named for the pale rings around its eyes, moves alone through the cloud forest, shy and rarely seen, climbing for fruit. It is the last of its kind on the continent, a survivor from an older world, holding on in the high places while the country below it changes hands again and again. These mountains were also, for a time, the country's first fortune, long before the oil. On the cool Andean slopes, in the cloud, grow some of the finest coffee and cacao in the Americas, and for much of the 19th century, it was coffee and chocolate, not crude, that paid the country's way. The terraced fields the Tomato Queequeg cut into these hillsides 1,000 years ago are still farmed by their descendants. When the oil came, the farms were left behind, and the country forgot for a while that it had ever fed itself. The mountains did not forget. The coffee is still there, still picked by hand, a quieter kind of fortune that asks for patience instead of luck. But the heart of Venezuela, the part that fills its rivers and shapes its map, lies to the south and east. It is one of the oldest landscapes anywhere on Earth, and it is so unlike the rest of the country that early travelers struggled to believe it was real. In the far southeast, the ground rises into vast, flat-topped mountains with sheer vertical walls, standing alone above the savanna like the broken pillars of something enormous. The local Pamon people call them tepuis, the houses of the gods. They are made of sandstone, laid down close to 2 billion years ago, before there were trees, before there were flowers, before almost anything that walks or grows today existed. The Andes are young mountains, a few tens of millions of years old. The tepuis are older than the Andes by 100 times over. They are among the oldest exposed rock on the surface of the planet. Because their tops are cut off from the lowland forest by cliffs that can run 1,000 feet straight down, each tepui has become an island in the sky. Life on top evolved alone, sealed off for ages, until many of the plants and small creatures up there exist on that single mountain and nowhere else in the world. On the summits live small black toads that cannot swim or hop well, and so escape danger by curling into a ball and rolling away down the rock like a pebble. Carnivorous plants line the bare stone, feeding on insects because the thin soil offers them nothing. It is its own world, raised into the cloud. The most famous of these mountains is called Roraima, rising more than 2,800 meters at the point where 3 countries meet. When word of these tabletop summits reached Europe, a writer named Arthur Conan Doyle imagined that creatures long gone from the rest of the planet might still be living up there, undisturbed, and he set a novel on a mountain like this one. He called it The Lost World. Much later, the same savanna and its floating mountains would shape the look of an animated film about a house carried away by balloons. The real place needs no invention. It is enough on its own. And on one of these mountains, water does something almost impossible. From the edge of a tepui called Aoyan Tepui, the Devil's Mountain, a thin river runs off the summit and simply falls. It drops 979 meters, a little over half a mile, the longest unbroken waterfall on Earth. The fall is so high that much of the water turns to mist on the way down and drifts off into the canyon before it ever reaches the river below. For most of human history, almost no one outside saw it. Even the Pamon stayed away from the mountain, believing it a dangerous place. The world only learned of the waterfall because a man went looking for something else entirely. In 1933, an American pilot named Jimmy Angel was flying low over this maze of cliffs, searching for a riverbed where he believed there was gold. Instead, he saw the waterfall and could hardly credit what he was looking at. He came back 4 years later, in 1937, and tried to land his small plane on top of the tepui to reach the place. The wheels sank into the soft ground, and the aircraft stuck fast. Angel and his 3 companions were unhurt, but they were stranded on the roof of a mountain with no way down but their own feet. It took them 11 days to climb off the tepui and walk back to the nearest settlement. News of the adventure spread, and the waterfall took his name, Angel Falls. But the plane stayed where it landed. For 33 years, it sat on top of the mountain, slowly weathering in the wind and the mist, while the falls he found drew travelers from across the world. Keep that aircraft in mind. It does not stay up there forever. The water that pours off the tepuis gathers eventually into the great artery of the country. The Orinoco is one of the largest rivers on the continent, draining close to 4/5 of Venezuela's land. It runs for more than 2,000 kilometers before fanning out into a maze of channels and finally reaching the sea. The Warao people have lived in that delta for thousands of years, their houses raised on stilts above the water, much like the villages that first gave the country its name. They move by canoe. Their world is made of water and the trees that grow out of it. For the Warao, the river is not a road to somewhere else. It is the whole world. Children learn to paddle before they can properly walk. From the mariche palm that grows in the swamp, they take almost everything. The starch from its pith for bread, the fiber from its leaves for hammocks and baskets, the grubs that live in its fallen trunks for food. Their name for themselves means the boat people. They were here long before the Spanish, long before the oil, long before the country had a name, and in the maze of the delta, where the land is too wet to build roads and too tangled to easily reach, they are here still, living much as they always have, at the far, quiet edge of a country that spent the last century tearing itself apart over a fortune they never asked for. The Orinoco does something that, for a long time, geographers refused to believe. Far upriver, near the border with Brazil, a natural channel splits off from the Orinoco and flows away to join a tributary of the Amazon, a river that feeds 2 of the greatest river systems on Earth at once, sending part of its water north to the Caribbean and part of it south into the Amazon basin. When the explorer Alexander von Humboldt mapped this branching waterway at the very end of the 1700s, European scientists dismissed it as impossible. It was not impossible, it was simply Venezuela refusing again to fit the rules. Humboldt found something else here too. In a cave in the eastern hills in 1799, he and his companions pushed into the darkness and heard a sound like a chamber full of harsh, clicking voices. The cave was full of birds, thousands of them, nesting deep underground where no light reaches, flying out only at night to feed on fruit. To find their way through the total blackness, they navigate by sound, clicking and listening to the echoes the way a bat does. The local people called them guacharos. We call them oil birds because their fat chicks were once boiled down for lamp oil. The cave is now the heart of one of the country's first protected areas. The birds still pour out of it at dusk, into a country that has changed beyond recognition above their heads, and find their way home in the dark exactly as they always have. South of the Orinoco, where the land tips into the great Amazon forest, live the animals the country sees least. The jaguar moves through this green dark, the largest cat in the Americas, strong enough to crack a turtle's shell or a caiman's skull with a single bite, and rare enough that most Venezuelans will go a lifetime without seeing one in the wild. Above the canopy hunts the harpy eagle, one of the most powerful birds of prey on Earth, with talons the size of a bear's claws, dropping through the leaves to take monkeys and sloths off the branches. And on the forest floor lives something most people would rather not meet. The Goliath bird-eater is the heaviest spider on the planet, its leg span as wide as a dinner plate, heavy enough that you can hear it moving through the dead leaves. Despite the name, it rarely eats birds. It hunts insects and small creatures in the dark, and when it is threatened, it rubs its legs together to throw a cloud of tiny barbed hairs into the air. It is one more reminder that the south of this country is its own continent, barely mapped, indifferent to the affairs of the cities far to the north. So, this is the land, snow and desert and rainforest. The oldest rock on the planet and the tallest waterfall. A lake that flashes all night and a river that runs to 2 oceans. None of it was created by oil, and none of it can be taken away by the loss of oil. It was here first. And yet, if you ask most people in the world today what they know about Venezuela, almost none of this is what they will tell you. They will tell you about collapse, about a failed economy, about a cautionary tale. And in doing so, they leave out almost everything you have just seen, and almost everything that makes the country itself. So before we follow the money down, it is worth saying plainly what the headlines leave out. The arepa, that simple cake of ground maize, is still split and stuffed and eaten by Venezuelans on every continent. The oldest thing in the national kitchen, outliving the newest crisis in the national accounts. Baseball, carried into the country 100 years ago by the same foreign oil workers who came for the crude, became the national passion, and Venezuela has sent more players to the major leagues of North America than almost any country on Earth. The joropo still turns, and in the 1970s, a musician named Jose Antonio Abreu began handing instruments to children in the poorest neighborhoods and teaching them to play together in orchestras. He called it simply the system. It has reached hundreds of thousands of young Venezuelans and produced conductors and players who now stand in front of the great orchestras of the world. A country can be in deep trouble and still be one of the most musical places alive. Both things, again, are true at once. And it is not only music. Walk into any Venezuelan kitchen, at home or in exile, and the table tells the same story of a culture that refuses to thin out. There is the pabellón criollo, the dish people call the flag of the country on a plate. Shredded beef and black beans and white rice with sweet fried plantain on the side. The colors of the land arranged by habit. There are tequeños, sticks of white cheese wrapped in dough and fried golden, the thing no celebration is allowed to begin without. And there is a fierce, particular national pride in beauty, in poise, in presentation, a country that has sent more winners to the world's great beauty contests than almost any other, and treats them like a national sport. It is easy to be glib about that, but it belongs to the same stubborn insistence that runs through the music and the food. Whatever else is taken, we will still know how to make something lovely. But the trouble is real, and it deserves to be understood, not waved away. So now we go back to the lake and to the oil, and we follow the line all the way down. For half a century, the oil seemed to be exactly what it promised to be: money. By the middle of the 20th century, Venezuela was the wealthiest country in Latin America, measured by income per person. Foreign companies pumped the crude, the government taxed it and built with it. New highways, new universities, a skyline of modern towers in Caracas. The country imported the newest cars from North America, and for a while there was a phrase, spoken half in pride and half in warning. They said Venezuela was so rich it was Saudi Arabia with rainforests. money so easy it seemed to fall from the sky. One Venezuelan saw the danger early. His name was Juan Pablo Perez Alfonso, and he was one of the architects of the country's oil policy. In 1960, he helped bring together the world's major oil exporters into a single group, so they could set prices together rather than be played off against one another. That group was OPEC, and Venezuela was one of its founders. Perez Alfonso understood the oil better than almost anyone, and what he came to believe about it was bleak. He watched the easy money pour in and watched it rot the country from the inside. Near the end of his life, he gave the oil a name that has followed it ever since. He called it the devil's excrement. "We are drowning," he said, "in the devil's excrement." He had helped build the engine of the country's wealth, and he died convinced it would ruin them.
To see why he was right,
You have to understand what oil money does to a country that leans on it too hard. When one resource becomes that valuable, it pulls everything else out of shape. The money flooding in makes the national currency strong, which sounds good, until you realize it makes everything the country grows or builds more expensive than the same thing shipped in from abroad. So, the farms struggle. The factories struggle. Why grow your own food or make your own goods when the oil can simply buy them cheaper from somewhere else? Year by year, the other parts of the economy wither until the country is balanced on a single column. As long as the price of oil stays high, the column holds. The trouble comes when it does not. And the price of oil does not stay anywhere. It rises and crashes on the decisions of distant markets, wars on the other side of the planet, the choices of other producers. A country built on one column is at the mercy of a number it cannot control. In the 1980s, that number fell. Oil prices dropped hard, and the money that had paid for everything dried up almost overnight. The government had borrowed heavily against the good years. Now the debts came due, and the income to pay them was gone. In February of 1989, a new government raised prices, including the price of bus fares, to try to steady the books. For people already living close to the edge, it was the breaking point. Protests began in the towns outside Caracas and spread into the capital. Crowds took to the streets. Shops were broken open. The government sent in the security forces. Over several days, in what Venezuelans remember as the Caracazo, hundreds of people were killed, many of them shot in the poor neighborhoods built up the hillsides. The official count has been disputed ever since because some of the dead were buried in mass graves before they could be named. It was a wound the country has carried for more than 30 years. Out of that anger came a young army officer who tried and failed to seize power by force in 1992. He was jailed for it, but he had spoken to a country that no longer believed in the men who had governed it, and the failed coup made him famous. 6 years later, in 1998, the same officer, Hugo Chavez, won the presidency at the ballot box, promising to take the oil wealth and put it directly into the hands of the poor. For a time, with oil prices climbing again, he did. Clinics and food programs reached people the old order had ignored, and millions who had felt invisible felt counted for the first time. But the deeper problem did not go away. It got worse. The state leaned harder on the oil than ever and spent the windfall as fast as it came. The National Oil Company, once run by some of the most skilled engineers in the developing world, saw thousands of those engineers fired after a bitter strike, and much of its hard-won expertise walked out the door with them. Investment in the wells and pipelines fell behind. The machinery aged, and the oil itself here was the difficult kind. Most of what remained was the thick, heavy crude of the Orinoco belt, the kind that needs special handling and outside technology to turn into anything useful. The expertise to do that was draining away at exactly the moment the country needed it most. Then, in 2014, the price of oil collapsed again, and this time the country had nothing else to fall back on. No strong farms, no strong factories, no savings set aside for a rainy day. Only the single column, and the column gave way. What followed is hard to take in even now. The economy shrank and kept shrinking until it had lost around 3/4 of its size, a collapse far deeper than the Great Depression once cut into the United States. To cover its bills, the government printed money, and the money lost its meaning. Prices doubled and doubled again and again, until at the peak, inflation ran past 1,000,000% in a single year. People carried banknotes in bags and weighed them instead of counting them, because counting took too long and the numbers were too large. Wages that were enough for groceries in the morning could not buy bread by the afternoon. Hospitals ran short of the most basic supplies. Store shelves emptied. To grasp how far the money fell, consider what was done to the currency itself. Twice in a few years, the government simply struck zeros off the banknotes, first 3 of them, then 5 more, redrawing the money so that one new bill stood in for 100,000 old ones. 8 zeros erased by decree because the numbers had grown too large to print or to count. People who had saved all their lives watched those savings turn into paper not worth the cost of the ink. A pension built over 40 years could end up worth less than a single egg. The cruelty of it was not only the hunger, it was the way it punished exactly the people who had done what they were told, who had worked and saved and trusted the money, and were left with nothing for their patience. And the failure spread beyond the money into the wires. Most of Venezuela's electricity does not come from burning fuel at all. It comes from water, from the Guri Dam on the Caroni River, one of the largest hydroelectric works ever built, a wall of concrete holding back a reservoir the size of a small sea. For decades it lit the cities and ran the factories, a quiet marvel of engineering paid for in the good years. But a dam is not a monument, it is a machine, and a machine needs tending, spare parts, trained hands, constant repair. As the money ran out and the skilled people left, the tending fell behind. In March of 2019, much of the country went dark at once. The national grid failed, and the failure spread from state to state until tens of millions of people lost power for days. In the heat, refrigerators warmed and food spoiled. Hospitals lost the machines that kept patients alive. Water stopped reaching the upper floors of apartment towers because the pumps had no power, and people climbed down to rivers and broken pipes to fill buckets by hand, in one of the most urbanized countries in Latin America. A nation sitting on the largest oil reserves on the planet and one of the largest dams on the continent could not reliably keep the lights on. That is what it looks like when a country spends its inheritance and stops maintaining the things that inheritance built. And so, the people did the one thing that was left. They left. On foot, by bus, in whatever way they could, close to 8 million Venezuelans walked out of their own country, the largest movement of people the Americas had ever seen outside of war. They crossed the mountains into Colombia in long lines. They went south to Peru, to Chile, to Brazil, to Argentina. They carried what they could and left the rest. Families split apart. some going ahead to send money home to those who stayed. The country that had once drawn workers in from across the world to drill its oil now watched a quarter of its own population pour out across the borders. Let that sit for a moment, because it should not be rushed past. The richest ground on earth and the people walking away from it. Now think back to the lake where this began. Lake Maracaibo, the water that gave the country its name, the place where the first great well blew out in 1922. The oil derricks still stand in that water, many of them rusting now, leaning, leaking, some of them silent. They stand in the same lake as the old stilt villages that the Spanish once mistook for a little Venice. The thing that named the country and the thing that broke it, side by side, in the same shallow water, under the same nightly lightning that has been flashing over the marsh through all of it, through the boom and the bust, the wealth and the loss, never once asking which it was looking down on. The devil's excrement, Perez Alfonso called it. He saw the whole arc from inside, and he was right, and being right did not save anyone. But here is the part the cautionary tale forgets to mention. A country is not its government, and it is not its bank balance, and it is not the price of a barrel on a faraway exchange. A country is its land and its people, and on that account, Venezuela is far from finished. Remember the plane on top of the Tepui? The small aircraft Jimmy Angel left stranded on the roof of the mountain. After 33 years up there in the wind, it was finally taken apart, lifted off the summit by helicopter, carried down, and restored. Today, it sits outside an airport in the river town of Ciudad Bolivar, the city named for the liberator. A thing left behind on a mountaintop, recovered and brought home. It is a small story, but it is the kind of story this country keeps telling itself.
Remember the arepa,
The cornmeal cake older than the country itself. It travels now. In the migrant neighborhoods of Lima and Bogota and Santiago and Madrid, there are griddles heating before dawn, and the smell that rises off them is the smell of home. Venezuelans abroad open small kitchens, and the first thing they make is the arepa, and the second thing they do is teach the children of their new countries to love it. Baseball diamonds appear in cities that never had them. The joropo plays at a wedding 3,000 kilometers from the plains it came from. The orchestras that Jose Antonio Abreu started keep playing, at home and in exile both. And remember Bolivar's dream, the one that fractured in his own lifetime, the dream of a continent bound together. He could not unite these nations by force or by argument, and yet his people, in their hardest hour, have spread themselves across every one of them, carrying their food and their music and their language into Colombia and Ecuador and Peru and beyond, knitting the continent together in the one way the liberator never imagined and never wanted. A union written not in victory, but in loss. It is not the union he dreamed of, but it is a kind of union all the same. The land itself keeps no account of any of this. The Tepuis have stood for close to 2 billion years, and 100 years of oil is less than the blink of an eye to them. The waterfall still falls and turns to mist before it lands. The lightning still flashes over the lake every night. The oil birds still pour out of Humboldt's cave at dusk and find their way home in the dark. The Orinoco crocodile, counted and carried back by hand, still slides into the river. None of it depends on the price of a barrel. None of it was ever for sale. The collapse is not over, and it would be a lie to pretend otherwise. The country's future is uncertain, and uncertainty is a hard thing to live inside. The oil is still in the ground, more of it than anywhere on Earth. And what it will mean for the next generation, no one yet knows. Some questions do not get a clean answer, and this is one of them. But a place is more than its worst decade. Venezuela was the land of grace, Columbus wrote, when he first saw this coast, and then men came and gave it a smaller name, and later still found the oil and called it a fortune, and the fortune curdled. Through all of those names, the country went on being itself, older than its wealth, larger than its loss, carried now in pieces, in millions of kitchens and on millions of small journeys by the people who had to leave it and did not stop being Venezuelan when they did. The richest land that fell to the poorest. That is the title, and it is true. But it is only the first line. The rest of the story is being written, quietly, in the places the oil never touched and never could. Take a breath. Stay a while. The lightning, you will find, is still going. Thank you for traveling with us. Until the next journey.